Welcome to Dweller of the Dark. We are a channel honoring the yellowed and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. More tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten are climbing out of the tubes. Subscribe, comment, like, donate, or I'll send the devil of black by you to rip your head off, as we did the like button. Unknown horror masters, send us ghoulish delights for the Skull and Bones collection. Your pound of writer's flesh will feed our ghouls for now. Books, albums, websites in the links below. Children of Horror, Legion of Ghouls. Vampire Village by Hugh Davidson. The pen name for the terrifying Edmond Hamilton. Knock again, I told Croft. There's always someone up in these village inns, and it's not midnight yet. I've almost hammered the door down already, he replied. Either these Transylvanians sleep like the dead, or what the devil? What's the matter? I inquired. He was shaking his hand ruefully. Bruised my knuckles on something on the door, he said irritably. He detached it from the door, then passed it to me. I saw that it was a little wooden cross. Mighty inconvenient way of expressing religious fervor, exclaimed Croft as he knocked again. I looked up and down the white road gleaming in the starlight. Along it were strung the score or so of high-peaked frame cottages that formed the village of Kranzak. Croft and I had counted as we had swung through the Transylvanian hills all day and evening on getting here a late supper and lodging for the night. But now Kranzak seemed to offer small prospect of either supper or bed, for from the shuttered windows of its houses showed no lights, and our hammering at the inn's door had produced no response. We had heard voices inside the inn as we had approached it, but at our first knock, they had become abruptly silent. Croft, annoyed by hurting his hand on the cross, called out now in our defective Hungarian. Let us in. This is an inn, isn't it? An elderly, tremulous voice answered. It is the inn of Kranzak, yes, but it opens to no one tonight. Why not? My companion demanded. The same voice answered. Because this is the night of vampires, sirs. The night of St. George, when all those who were in life vampires and servants of evil rise again to work evil until dawn. No door here in Kranzak will open until dawn. Night of the devil? I exclaimed. What kind of craziness is this? Croft laughed, ha ha ha, turning from the door. No use, Barton. We've run into their superstitions, and it looks like no lodging for us tonight. A different and shriller voice called from inside. If you want lodging, go on to Weisland, it told us, and was followed by a buzz of 3 or 4 voices within. We stepped back into the road, baffled, looking along the village's houses. Each had some sort of cross at its door, and each was still dark and without invitation. Well, it looks as if we go on to Weisland, wherever it may be, I said. Weisland? I don't remember it on the map, Croft said. But these villages are all pretty close together, so it can't be far. Forward march then, I ordered, and we started along the road in the starlight. The night of St. George, night of the vampires, I repeated, as we swung out of the village and on through the dark pine woods. Was that whole village sitting behind locked doors in fear of that old vampire superstition, Croft? He nodded. It's a very deep belief here in Transylvania. These Transylvanians believe implicitly that when people die who have sold themselves to evil, they become not dead, but undead, become vampires who rise from their tombs by night to suck blood and life from others. I've read something of the belief, of course, I said, but I thought vampires could rise any night between sunset and dawn. I didn't know this St. George's night was the only night in the year in which they could rise. Croft laughed. There's a distinction between vampires, Barton. All vampires can rise from their graves each night until priests have carried out over their graves the binding and exorcising rites that prison them there. But on this one night each year, St. George's night, even these prison vampires, who far outnumber the others, can rise and work evil until dawn. Which is why St. George's night finds them locked up back there at Kranzak, I said, shaking my head. And those crosses on the doors, I asked, jerking a thumb toward the little wooden one Croft had passed me, which I had thrust into my breast pocket. He smiled. To protect them from the vampires tonight, of course. A cross is the one sure weapon against vampires, you know. The one thing they fear. It's almighty interesting, this vampire superstition. And mighty inconvenient for us, I added. If this Wiseland's people are as terrorized by vampires tonight as Kranzak's, we're out of luck for sure. We hitched our knapsacks higher on our shoulders and bent to the steady task of walking. The white road wound through dense forest, up a long slope that seemed to pass between the big hills ahead and to the right. There was no moon, but the thin starlight outlined the road clearly in its windings through the dark pine woods. As we swung on for steady mile after mile, it came to me that the very gloominess of this somber Transylvanian landscape must be at the bottom of its people's fearful beliefs. It would be easy to believe, I speculated, that in the midnight darkness of the hills about us, supernatural beings of evil were moving, loosed this one night from the tomb. We could see once or twice black, flying shapes of considerable size moving in the starlight low over distant woods. And while it was apparent enough to Croft and me that these must be hawks or owls searching the night forest for prey, I could well see, I thought, how any Transylvanians seeing them would believe them vampires abroad on this their night. Croft's voice at last interrupted my speculations. There are the lights of a village down there, he announced. Wiseland's, I suppose. We had reached the rim of a bowl-shaped valley some miles across that was encircled by the hills. Down in the darkness at this bowl's center gleamed a little pattern of lights, with at one spot the redder glow of fires. Nothing shut up about Wiseland, apparently, I said with rising spirits. We may get supper and a bed tonight after all. Looks as though there's a chance of it, at any rate, Croft agreed. We swung down into the bowl-like valley toward the village's lights. Wiseland, it was apparent as we entered it, was a place unusually ancient, for the houses along its little streets were more antique in appearance than any we had yet seen. They had the grotesquely carved scrollwork and odd-shaped doors and windows common to the houses of the section a few hundred years ago. These houses were illuminated with yellow candlelight, but we could see no occupants in them as we passed among them. The reason for this was explained when we neared the open green at the village's center, for large fires were burning there. Swift, gay music was audible, and gathered round the firelit green and dancing to the music were the people of Wiseland. As Croft and I approached, we could see these people only as black shapes dancing between us and the glowing fires. Their dark forms spun with such swiftness that to us, with the light in our eyes, they seemed to leave the ground and whirl through the air in the mad rush of the dance. Croft and I drew nearer and stopped in the shadows outside the fire-lit green circle, watching with astonishment. A half-dozen fires spilled ruddy light across the green, and around each fire, one of the strange dances was going on. The dancers were clad, the men in outlandish brilliant jackets and tight trousers, the women in similarly bright skirts and bodices, the festal attire of Transylvanian peasants. Yet these costumes were of an older and odder style than any others we had seen. Around the green's edge, in the firelight, were 100 or 2 villagers watching and applauding the dance. They were clad like the dancers, there being, in fact, no modern dress visible. At one place was a peasant orchestra of stringed instruments pouring out the wild, swift music. Besides this, a tall, white-mustached and fierce-faced oldster was calling above the din to the dancers as they whirled and spun. I had never seen such a strange picture of mad gaiety, and Croft and I watched, marveling, from back in the shadows. These anciently dressed villagers seemed flinging themselves into the merriment of the dance with utter abandon. The eyes of dancers and spectators alike glowed crimson, apparently from reflected firelight. Suddenly, one of the spectators glimpsed Croft and me back in the dark. He uttered a stabbing cry, and instantly, all of them were rushing toward us. In our momentary stupefaction, it almost seemed that they were hurtling through the air to attack us, a crowded vision of crimson eyes and white gleaming teeth. But when almost upon Croft and me, they stopped short, as though struck back. They encircled us, giving vent to a babble of excited cries in a Hungarian dialect that was almost beyond our understanding, while their excited gleaming eyes held upon us. The din was immense.
Excitable beggars, aren't they?
Said Croft.
Can you make out what they're shouting about?
Not while they're all crying at once, I answered. What's the matter with them? I thought for a moment they were attacking us.
These Transylvanians are all an excitable bunch, he said. This looks like the head man of the village coming, and he ought to be able to calm them down.
It was the tall, white-mustached oldster who had been calling to the dancers, who now shouldered through the throng toward us. He was dressed like the rest in the brilliant ancient festal costume, which set off his tall figure well enough. He bowed to us, his eyes sharp upon ours.
Welcome to Wiseland, sirs.
He addressed us in the oddly twisted dialect of the others.
We did not expect strangers here tonight. I'm sorry if we've intruded on your festal celebrations,
Croft told him.
We didn't mean to do so.
The other waved the apology aside smilingly.
My people here, I am Mihe Hallows, headman of Wiseland. See, but few strangers, and so are excited when any visit our little village. Well, it's not by intention we came, Croft said. Back at the last village, Kranzak, everyone was locked up for fear of vampires. They must have been afraid we were vampires ourselves, for they wouldn't let us in, but told us to go on to Wiseland.
Hallows' smile deepened and a laugh ran through the crowd.
Kranzak's people are much afraid of vampires on this night, it is true. the headman said. For not far from Kranzak was located the vampire village.
Vampire village?
Croft repeated interrogatively, but Hallows waved his hand. It is a belief in this part of Transylvania. I will tell you the story later. It keeps many villages in fear on this night. Well, I'm glad at any rate it doesn't keep you of Wiseland locked up, I remarked. We didn't fancy walking all night.
You'll find excellent accommodations here at Wiseland,
Hallows assured me.
Indeed. You could have come at no better time than tonight.
Again, the chuckling laugh ran through the crowd, though I could see nothing humorous in the words. These gleaming-eyed, strangely dressed villagers were making both Croft and myself rather uncomfortable by their staring at us from all sides, and Hallows must have seen this.
Our inn is over there, at the green's edge, he said. May I not lead you there?
We protested against his taking the trouble, but with true Transylvanian courtesy, he waved our protest aside. Hallows motioned the villagers to make way for us and was turning again toward us when I bumped awkwardly into him face to face. To my surprise, he staggered and fell to his knees, his hand on his heart and his face contorted by a spasm of agony. He regained his feet, though, before we had time to help him up, and I apologized as best I could for my clumsiness.
It was not your fault,
he said, with hands still on his breast.
But I have a weakness here, and the thing in your breast pocket prodded me when we collided.
I looked down and saw projecting from my breast pocket the little wooden cross Croft had handed me at Kranzak, which I had forgotten. I'm very sorry, I said. It was stupid of me to run into you. Hallows smiled and shook his head, but I noticed as we started through the crowd toward the end that he kept Croft between him and myself. Apparently, he did not intend trusting himself again to my awkwardness. And as we moved through the gay-dressed villagers who parted to allow us passage, I even thought that they shrank rather farther away from me than from Croft. It was a little discomforting to me. Hallows talked on urbanely as he led us to the inn. The music behind us had recommenced, and the villagers were again dancing by the time we came to the ancient-looking inn at the green's edge. We followed the headman into the stone-paved, broad-beamed tavern room. A great fire flickered in a wall fireplace, and behind the small bar at the room's end, the fat and white-haired innkeeper was serving bottles of queer, twisted shapes to a dozen gay-costumed men and women. They had been engaged in wild talk and laughter as we entered, but fell dead silent at sight of Hallows and ourselves staring toward us. I was struck again by the trick of the firelight falling upon these people's faces to make their eyes seem somehow crimson lit. The fat innkeeper came forward and Hallows made introduction.
This is Galant, innkeeper of Wiseland,
and as excellent a one as can be found in Transylvania, he told us smilingly.
He will be glad to see you, for it is not often he lodges strangers. Not often,
admitted the fat Callant, laughing in a strange way.
In fact, it is not often that I have custom of any kind. You will wish 2 rooms, sir? Oh, 1 room will do for both of us,
Croft answered.
We're more concerned about supper
They're in the room right now. If you will, do us an honor. Halos interjected. Our Wiseland festivities on this feast night continue all night, and some of us leading villages always have supper here at 2 o'clock. You would honor us by joining us. We'll be honored to do so, Croft said. It's almost 2 now, so Barton and I had better brush up a little. I will show you the room, sirs, said Kalan, turning with a candle toward the narrow stair that rose back in the shadows. We were entering the dark stairway with him when Halos' voice stopped us. He was gesturing with an amused smile toward the wooden cross that still projected from my breast pocket. That emblem of piety were best left in your room, sir, he told me smilingly. On this night, piety is forgotten here, and we think but of merriment. Croft and I laughed. It's not really mine, I told the head man, but of course I'll leave it. I don't want to be the skeleton at your feast. As we went up the dark, narrow stairway after the fat Kalant, I heard a sudden babble of wild voices break out in the tavern room we had just quitted. There cut across them and silenced them the sharp voice of Halos, and I smiled at this evidence that our courtly host could play the tyrant over his simple subjects when so inclined. The stair led up into a long hall dimly lit by 1 or 2 candles in wall sockets along it. There were doors but half visible in the shadows, and Kalant led us to one of these and opened it, gesturing inside as he placed his candle in a socket inside the door. This will suit you, sirs, he told us. It's a little musty. We don't often have custom here, which should be comfortable enough. It's quite all right, we assured him. Tell Halos we'll be down in a few moments. He bowed and withdrew. We looked about us. Musty is right, I commented. Looks as if it hadn't been used for centuries. The room, in fact, was covered with dust that lay thick over the floor and furniture, an old-fashioned wooden bed. Through the odd-shaped windows, we could glimpse the green outside, where the fires still were burning, and the dark shadows of the dancers whirling to the wild music. Croft and I spruced up as well as possible and then left the room. When we emerged from the dark stairway into the inn's tavern room again, we found the head man Halos there with 24 or more men and women. They were, without exception, dressed in the antique festal costumes to which we were now accustomed. Halos almost rushed to meet us as we entered the tavern room, his eyes alight. But a little from us he stopped, staring at my breast. I looked down and saw that I had forgotten to discard the little wooden cross from that pocket. Oh, I'm sorry, I said, but I suppose having the thing doesn't really matter. Of course not, he told me courteously. Will you not meet some of our people? These are my own 2 daughters. He made introductions, and we chatted as best we could in our halting Hungarian with the gay groups. I was somewhat chagrined, I admit, to see that they tended to gather around Croft and to avoid me. Recalling the head man's words, I supposed they judged from the cross projecting from my pocket that I was some strict and serious devotee. Croft saw my isolation and shot amused glances at me now and then, for he was making great progress with the 2 brilliant-cheeked beauties Halos had introduced as his daughters. Halos himself talked with me, though at a little distance, until the fat Kalant appeared from another room to announce that the supper was ready. We passed into the candlelit dining hall, where a long table laden with Transylvanian dishes and wines awaited us. Hallow seated himself at the table's end with Croft and the younger daughter at his right, and me and the elder daughter at his left. But before I could address a word to this elder sister, she pulled her chair as far as possible from me and turned her back upon me to talk to her other neighbor. The supper was gay, and Croft and the younger sister opposite me were of the gayest, though I was feeling somewhat chagrined at the cold treatment these people accorded me. I made up for it by attacking the spicy foods and strong wines with vigor. Nor was Croft much behind me, since we had not eaten for a dozen hours. The foods and wines were as delicious as I had ever tasted, but seemed strangely lacking in filling qualities. In fact, after disposing of a half dozen dishes and several glasses, I felt really as hungry as on beginning. Yet though Croft too looked a little puzzled, the others at table seemed not to notice it. The room rang with laughter, chatter, and clink of glasses, with echoes now and then of the dance music from outside. Calunt hovered about to see that all were served, and at the table's end, Hallows was the picture of a courteous host. During a lull in the chatter of voices, Croft addressed him. "You said you'd tell us about the vampire village located near Kranzak," he reminded. "I'd like to hear the story, if the rest don't mind." Hallows smiled, and I saw suppressed mirth on the faces of our companions, Calunt grinning in the background. "Why, all here know it well," the headman said. "What if it would interest you?" At our quick assurance, he went on. "We of Transylvania have for many centuries known that vampires do exist. We have known that men and women who sell themselves in life to the forces of evil do not, when they die, become dead, but undead vampires. By day, vampires lie as though dead in their graves, but by night rise as though living and suck blood and life from whatever unprotected people they encounter. We Transylvanians know also that against the cross, vampires are powerless. So whenever a vampire's grave is detected in this country, priests perform over it ceremonies of the cross that bind the vampire in his grave. Yet even vampires, so bound and prisoned, can on one night of the year, the night of St. George, still rise and work until dawn. Almost 250 years ago, there was in this section of Transylvania a village located not far from Kranzak. And this village near Kranzak came to be haunted by vampires, as no village had ever been before. The forces of evil worked there until in the graves of that village lay some hundreds of vampires who came forth each night. It was then a vampire village. The living people left in it fled to Kranzak and other places, but the vampires remained. Each day, that village lay deserted and untenanted beneath the sun, but each night, the vampires rose to move through and inhabit the village as though alive, venturing often to attack people in nearby villages. So, at last, the people of the surrounding section came with many priests to put an end to this vampire village. Over each grave, the priests carried out their binding rites, prisoning each vampire thus. From then on, though no living people ever again inhabited it, the vampires came forth no more by night, save on that one night each year, the night of St. George, when all vampires are freed. On that night, the vampire village again swarms until dawn with its undead inhabitants. And since the night of St. George is tonight, Croft smiled, they feared back in Kranzak that we too were from the vampire village? That is so, said Hallows, also smiling. For despite the centuries that have passed, they of Kranzak and the other villages still fear this night of the year, when the vampire village wakes to life again. But you here in Wiseland tonight don't seem to have much fear of the village of vampires, I said. They all laughed at that. It is because St. George is our patron, and so on his festal night, we have his protection, Hallows explained, and can give ourselves up to merrymaking without fear. Croft shook his head. Strange, the power of some of these beliefs, he said. Yet they fit with your ancient houses and costumes somehow. The elder Hallows girl laughed. These costumes we wear on this festal night, all of us, but they must seem very odd to you, she told Croft. They seem beautiful, he told her. Yet they make me feel as though Barton and I had in some way strayed into the past. Our dances are ancient ones, too, on this night, she said. Will you not come with my sister and me to watch them? Her invitation so pointedly excluded me that Croft shot a grinning glance at me as he accepted. Coming along, Barton? He asked as we all rose. I shook my head. I'm going upstairs and get some much-needed sleep, I told him. It's almost morning, you know. Our company passed back into the tavern room, Croft between the two sisters and I with Hallows at my side. It was evident to me that Croft had made an impression on the two gay-clad beauties, for their eyes and little white teeth gleamed alike as they laughed up to him, their hands tightening on his arms in a caressing and almost possessive manner. I'll be up shortly, Barton, Croft told me as they turned to the door. I could stand some sleep myself, all right? Sleep? There is enough of sleep in the world, exclaimed the younger sister. Tonight is a festal night, and not for sleep, but for life, for life. She spoke with astounding vehemence and with eyes really fiery, rather startling Croft and myself also. Hallows, his own eyes crimson, shot her a furious look, and at that she dropped her lashes demurely. As Croft went out with them, I gave him a meaning glance, telling him not to make a fool of himself over the two Transylvanian beauties. Most of the company followed them, and I bade them a general good night. To Hallows and Callant, who remained, I added my thanks before starting up the stair. As I went up the dark stairway, I thought I heard a quick step below and turned, but there was no one beneath. I heard Hallows' voice hissing to someone, evidently Callant. Not yet, you fool! He has it still with him! Callant's muttered answer was inaudible, but their dispute was apparently no affair of mine, and I went on up to our room. In the dim candlelight, the musty bed was unattractive, but I sat down, yawning, glancing out the dusty window. The fires on the green still glowed red, but the music had stopped, and the dark shapes of the villagers seemed clustered round some object of interest. I loosened my collar, tossing onto the table with a smile the wooden cross whose significance of piety had given the villagers such a distaste for me. I was tossing our fat little blue guidebook after it when it occurred to me to look up Wiseland's exact location in it. Croft had said that Wiseland was not on the map, and I found it to be so, there being no village at all marked there, between that of Kranzak and the distant one of Hoff. Somewhat puzzled, I turned to the book's text, but found no description of Wiseland there either, and was giving up with disgust at the inefficiency of guidebook makers when the name Wiseland in a footnote caught my eye. As I started to read this, I was aware subconsciously of two things: of a rush and commotion among the dark crowd out on the village green, and of the rustling sound of someone moving in the hall outside my door. But had thunder detonated about me, it could not have aroused in me the unutterable horror that was rising in me as I read the fine type of the footnote. The words seemed dancing before my eyes. Wiseland, approximately midway between Kranzak and Hoff, deserted entirely in 1683 through fear of vampires, still called in that section the Vampire Village, now almost wholly in and even as the terrific truth smashed home to my reeling brain, there thrust to my ears from the green outside an agonized scream in Croft's voice. I leapt across the room and flung the door open. Hallos and Callant stood out it with eyes gleaming hell crimson at me out of the faces of fiends. The two shot as one through the air toward me, and as they bore me backward, I felt their sharp fangs at my throat, felt in my face their breath like airs of cold corruption from the grave. But as I reeled backward with those two hell vampires upon me, my outflung hand touched the table, and something on the table that my fingers closed on instinctively and that I thrust against them. It was the little cross, and as it touched them, it hurled them back across the room and against the wall as though titanic forces had smitten them. With eyes red flames of hell, Hallos and Callant glared from there at me as I swayed to the door, Croft's scream stabbing again and weaker to my ears. I was flinging myself down the dark stairway with the two black, fire-eyed shapes of Hallos and Callant after me, the cross still clutched in my grasp. I was reeling out onto the green to hear again Croft's muffled cry. Croft was down, and the madly whirling, scarlet-eyed vampire throng was upon him, white teeth seeking his throat. Half of them were rushing toward me, black fiend shapes against the fires that were dimming as a faint promise of light showed eastward. Black vampire shapes that were about me and separating me from Croft. They recoiled and parted as I stumbled forward, extending the cross. They raged about me like mad shadow shapes of hell, their baffled shrieks in my ears. I was at Croft's side, and those upon him recoiled as I dropped beside him with the cross. He seemed senseless, and I felt my own senses going, and the cross dropping from my weakened fingers as around us raged the ghastly vampire horde. They were closing upon us as the cross slipped from my nerveless hand. The fiend faces of Hallos and his daughters and all the others spun closer in a mad vista of red eyes and avid lips and sharp white teeth. And then, from the paling east, struck a gray shaft of dawn. Instantly, it was as though gray mist enveloped the vampire throng and all the village about us, a mist that darkened in my mind as I lost consciousness. The dawn light eastward had changed from gray to gold. When I came back to consciousness, Croft was stirring weakly, and as he sat up, I saw and picked from the ground beside me, automatically, a little wooden cross. We staggered to our feet and gazed dazedly about us. ancient, weed-grown ruins stretched in the golden light around us. There were broken masonry outlines of building foundations, and in one place an enclosure of half-visible, time-worn tombstones. But there was no standing house or structure or any sign of life. Croft and I stared, wordlessly, wildly, all the world silent about us in the light of the morning sun. Thank you for listening. Have a great night.